Hey, this is Josh for Retooled.net, and in this video I'm going to talk about some of the changes to the timeline panel in the new version of Premiere. Now there are a lot of changes to the timeline panel, so some of them are new keyboard shortcuts, new levels of customization, new ways to monitor your audio levels. There are a ton of new features, but I think what the most important feature is the way that you perform insert and overwrite edits. So that's kind of where I want to start, and then I'm going to go through all the other little features as well, because they are significant to your workflow in the Premiere Pro timeline. So I'm here in Premiere Pro CS6 to look at how performing an edit worked in CS6. I have this clip which has an audio and video portion to it, and let's say I want to insert this clip into my timeline and I want to put it on video layer 4 and audio layer 2 on top of this clip. So first thing I'm going to do is mark this clip by using the / key, and then I'm just going to set an in on my source clip here, and I'm going to move my source panel, so I want to go to V4, video 4 over here, and I want to go to audio 2 over here. So let's say I hit the period key on my keyboard, and let's take a look at what happens. So you'll notice that first of all, my audio didn't write to my timeline, and my video did write to my timeline, but it also deleted all the other clips that were there. So the way it worked in CS6, if I undo that, was your patch panels over here, your source patches, needed to be combined with your track targets. So if I wanted the audio to go to A2, now if I hit period, the video goes to video 4 and the audio goes to A2. But then you'll also notice it's also knocking out all my other clips. So in order to perform this edit, I'd have to hit shift to untarget all these channels, and I'll do it again on the audio. So I basically hit shift while clicking, and then I would target only video 4 and only audio 2, now hit period. So you can see why for a lot of people this is way too many steps, and for me, coming from a Final Cut 7 background, I really didn't like the way this worked. For those people maybe coming from Avid who are used to sort of the source patch and track target sort of workflow working hand in hand this way, they might be more used to it. But for me, it was kind of cumbersome, and I think even people coming from Avid has a lot more ways to customize what tracks are targeted, and Premiere CS6 didn't really have that. So now if I come over to the new version of Premiere and I take a look at how the same operation works, again, I think this is the biggest change in the timeline panel, so that's why I want to go over this first. So now if I come over to the new version of Premiere, I have basically the same edit here, and if I want to perform the same operation, I can mark the clip that I want to replace, or right on top of in this case, hit the / key exactly the same as it used to. Now if I click on my source patches, and I'll patch V1 over to V4, and I'll patch A1 over to A2. So now this is exactly the same thing I had set up in the other timeline. You'll notice A2 is not a targeted track. It's not targeted to be active. So again, if I hit the period key, this time you'll notice it did exactly what I want. It didn't knock out all the clips below it, and I didn't need for A2 to be active to perform that edit. So in the new version of Premiere Pro, basically when you're doing insert and overwrite edits, the only thing it's taking into account is what your source patches are. So if I wanted to write to V3, I could just hit the period key and it writes to V3, and A2 is patched down here, so that is what that wrote to also. Now I could put something on V2 and untarget that. That's not a necessary step, but I'm just showing you it doesn't need to be targeted. So if I hit period, that'll go to V2. So now I'm just going to delete all these clips and start showing you some of the other differences to the timeline panel. Now just looking at the two timelines, if I tab over to CS6, you can see that the track headers and the buttons all look different. So you can see there's a snapping button here, a set encore chapter marker, and an add marker button. If I go over to the new version of Premiere, you'll see that there's this new button. And when I hover over it, you'll see it says insert and overwrite sequences as nests or individual clips. Now, I did a whole video on this button, so I'm not going to get too into detail in it here, but basically what it does is allow you to treat nests as either a single clip, as was the case in CS6 and before, or to actually insert and overwrite a nest into your sequence with all of its individual source clips intact. So it's a great organizational tool. Again, I'm not going to go into it too much here, but we have a whole video dedicated to this. Again, you'll see there's a snapping button just like before. And instead of the encore chapter marker and the marker button, it's been consolidated just to an add marker button. So if I click on it and add a marker, and then if I just double click on that marker, you'll see I can still set it as a chapter marker. It's just not a dedicated button. So the functionality is still there. So I'm just going to undo setting that marker. And now there's this new button called Timeline Display Settings. And you'll see there's a whole number of settings here, which I want to go through as well. Now, if I come down to the actual track names, you'll see that there's a different layout there as well. So in CS6, there was the source patch. To target a track, you clicked on the track name here. And then there's also this eyeball or toggle track output and the toggle sync lock control. And then if I click here, that will lock or unlock the track. If I go over to the new version, you'll notice that basically all the same controls are there. So if I click on it, I can lock the track and I can also toggle the active track. But clicking on the whole thing isn't activating the track, just this one part where the track name is. There's also the sync lock and of course the toggle track output as well. It's just a slightly different layout. Now the way source and target patches work are also different. So you saw the different behavior, but there's also a lot more customization here. So going into expanding and collapsing the panels, if I double click on a track, you'll notice it expands it. Double click again, it'll contract it. And if I hit shift and do that, it'll either expand or collapse all of those tracks as well. And of course the same thing works with audio, so I'll hold shift and then do it again, hold shift. And you'll notice I can either expand or collapse the audio tracks as well. Now in the same vein, there are new keyboard shortcuts that are assigned by default to this function of expanding or contracting the track height. Now this was possible in CS6, but there weren't default shortcuts. So I'm going to open up the keyboard dialog. I have that set up to Control K in my keyboard shortcuts. And if I go into this and type in the word track height, you'll see there's a few new things. There's track height presets, which I'll go over in a second. And there's also the ability to decrease audio track height with the option and minus. And I could also increase it with the option and equals. And same thing for video with the command minus and the command and equals. So let me just show you how that works. If I hit command and equals, you'll notice it'll expand all my tracks together. If I hit command and minus, it'll contract the height together. If I use option and equals and option and minus, it'll do the same thing. So that's functionality that was already there. It's just a default keyboard shortcut has been assigned to it. Now, if I look at the source panel, you could learn a lot in the new timeline panel by right-clicking. So if I click on it, you'll see there's a setting that says toggle all sources, which will basically shut all of them on or off. Of course, if I had a multi-video or multi-audio source track, I could have multiple patches set up. So if I was using a Nest that had 4 tracks of video, I could have multiple patches assigned at the same time, and of course the same thing for audio. Set all sources to gaps, and basically what this does, if I click on it and activate that, and let me just move it down to V1, let me show you how it works. I'm going to mark this clip, and I'm going to hit period to perform an overwrite edit, and you'll notice that it had more of the behavior that it had in CS6. So basically what you can do is use it to basically delete a clip. So that one was set to a gap and that one was set to write. So the audio wrote while the video deleted. So that's a new power you have there. I'm just going to undo that operation and I'm going to uncheck the gap command there so it's set to be a normal patch. If I right click again, you'll see I can do default source assignment, which will basically set everything back to V1 and A1. And of course you can save source presets. So let's say a lot of the time I want to edit my graphics to track V4, and I know my graphic audio or the sound effects for it might go onto A2. I can right click here and hit save preset, and I'll call this graphics V4 A2. And of course I can assign a source assignment preset, which I could then assign a keyboard shortcut to as well. I'm just going to do it with the mouse right now just so it's easier for you guys to see. I'll hit OK, and if I were to reset everything back to the default source and then I were to want to input graphics, I could just right click and hit graphics V4 A2 and everything will be patched to where I want it. Of course I can then manage these presets as well, and I can just delete them or assign a keyboard shortcut after the fact. So in this case I'm just going to delete it, hit OK. I can also control the behavior of this button by right-clicking and hitting Nest Source Sequences, and you'll see it change the state of that button. And of course I can move my patch panels by right-clicking as well and saying assign V1, or I'll do it again here, assign V1. Of course you can just do that by clicking as well, or by dragging. So all of that is possible. Now there are similar options for the track targeting. If I only have one track targeted, I can right-click and hit toggle all tracks. I could do it again to turn that back on. If I hit shift, it will untarget them just like it would in CS6. Now if I put on the target for V1 and hit move all targets up, you can just move it up a level or move it down a level. And then of course there is this feature that says targets follow inserts and overwrites. So I'm going to turn that on and show you how that works. So let's say I have track V1 and V2 and A1 targeted right now, but I want to do an edit to track V3 and A2 over here. So I'm just going to move my source panel. I'm going to hit period to do an overwrite edit, and now you'll notice that my targets followed my overwrite edit. So now V3 is targeted and A2 is targeted. And this is helpful if you're going to be doing a lot of work on a single track. You can leave that setting on. So now let's say I only want to do match frames on V3. Now that that's the only track targeted, I can hit F and it'll do a match frame on that clip. Just to show you what I mean by that, if V1 was the targeted track and I hit F to do a match frame, it will target the clip below it, even though this clip is on top of it. So now that I've basically covered the source and the targets, let's go through this menu up here, the timeline settings display. Whereas in CS6, you had to control these things on a per track basis, now you can control it overall, and I think this is a lot more convenient. So for instance, I could turn on all video keyframes on all my tracks at once, and I could shut them off, of course. I can choose whether I'm showing video names or not on my clips, and I'll leave that on. And then of course I have the same option for audio waveforms and audio keyframes, and of course all of these are assignable to keyboard shortcuts. So if I hit Control K, which is my custom shortcut for that dialog box, I could come in here and I can set keyboard shortcuts to do something like show my video keyframe. So I'll search the word keyframe, and you see I already set one up, which is Control Command W for audio keyframes and Control Option W for video keyframes. So if I hit Control Option W, there's my video keyframes, and Control Command W, there's my audio keyframes. So it's really nice to be able to have a keyboard shortcut to be able to control that. I also have other options like showing clip markers or not, showing the duplicate frame markers, which we have a whole video on, so I'm not going to get too into detail here, but basically it shows you if you have the same clips in your timeline more than once. Show through edits, which basically just shows you if you have a cut and then a continuous clip on either side of it. So for instance, if I turn that setting on, and I go to my blade tool and I make a cut, you'll see this is a through edit because this clip is continuous from the left side to the right side. So I'm just going to undo that, go back to my arrow tool and shut the through edit setting off. You'll notice up here I also have the ability to minimize all tracks, expand all tracks, save track height presets. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I go to expand all tracks and then I want to make video 1 huge, and audio 1 huge, and audio 2 kind of small, and same thing on video 2. I could come up here, save a preset, weird preset, and then let's say I were to shift double click to collapse all my tracks. I could then quickly come back and recall that track expansion with my weird preset, also known as weird preset, and there it is again. So you can see it's really customizable to your own personal needs here. We also have the new ability to customize the video and audio headers. So let me show you what I mean. I could come in here and say I never use the sync locks, let's shut them off. Or the same thing with the toggle track output. I can choose whether my keyframe button or my go to previous or go to next keyframe button is visible. And there's even more interesting options in the audio. So if I go to customize audio header, you'll see I have some new features here. So one of them that I find really interesting is the track meter. So if I drag that down and hit OK, and then I have my speakers muted, but basically you can see I have my main audio meters here, but then now I have a separate track audio meter. Of course I could expand this header to make it even larger. So this will let me see exactly what each track is contributing to my final audio output. So you'll see I also can reset the layout, and there's also features such as adding the left-right balance or even track volume right down there. So I think between the track targeting presets, the track toggling presets, and all of these new track header presets, the new timeline is really customizable, and it works a lot better for my personal needs anyway. Of course, you can still come in and rename your tracks just like you could in the past. So let's say instead of V3, I want this to be called B-roll. I could just come in here and rename that track, and there it is. Now, something we also now have is the ability to mute and solo audio tracks right from the timeline. So let's say I want to mute my music track here. You'll see that only my second track is playing, and if I unmute it, now they're both playing, and I could solo a track as well. And of course, if I had the custom audio meters on for each track, you'd be able to see which ones are muted and soloed individually quite easily. Now in CS6, we sort of had this functionality, but it couldn't be done from the timeline itself. So basically what you'd have to do is go into the audio mixer and mute and solo and enable recording for your individual tracks. You couldn't do it on the timeline panel itself. So again, it's super customizable, and there's a ton of things you can do here. There's also some new features. For instance, you'll see how a cross dissolve looks different in the new version of Premiere than it did in CS6. So there are a lot of differences, some that I didn't even touch on, but there's a ton of new customization here.